too. Before we get into all of that, just a really brief introduction to who we are. We are the Long Point Basin Land Trust. So we are located out of the Long Point Basin. So that is Norfolk County, Haldimand County, and then parts of Elgin, Oxford, Brant County, that whole area there. Most of our reserves are in Norfolk County. If you like this, if you want to learn more about us, you want to visit our reserves, make sure to visit our website, which is longpointlandtrust.ca. Sign up for our newsletter, which is just on our homepage there at our website, and make sure you're following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We're at LPBLT. Don't say that too quickly. You might get a little tongue twister there. So again, here is that Long Point Basin. We're one of the most biodiverse regions in all of Canada, part of this Carolinian Canada zone that you can see here in green, which is very exciting. We have 10 nature reserves, most of which are open to the public, and we would welcome and love for our public to come and join us and visit them. All across the Norfolk area. So some of them are just really, really incredible. There's a couple wetland reserves if you're into bird watching. Jackson Gun is this incredible old growth forest stand that's pretty close to Port Rowan there as well. Really great, highly recommend it. Go to our website and you can learn details about all of them on there as well. And then again, before we start, we want to really, really, really incredibly thank all of our amazing, amazing funders, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. So you can see them all up here on the screen: Norfolk Community Foundation, Execulink, Flap Canada, Gloria Myers, Millard's Nature Conservancy, Port Rowan Farmers Market, Ruffins, Otter Valley Naturalists, Grand Experiences. So many different organizations here. They're just absolutely fantastic. And then again, a lot of our funding for this comes from people like you. And so if you can afterwards give us a little tip or a donation, it would just help us conserve more land in this incredibly biodiverse area that we are in. All right, well, that's it from me. I don't want to keep talking too much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Sheila Colla of York University, who is going to talk to us all about bees, which I'm very, very excited about.
Hi there, thanks so much for having me, and I'll just get started with my presentation right away. And I guess, Joelle, you'll take over on admitting people as they come in?
Yes, I will. Thank you for doing that.
So we will be taking questions. I think the chat is open, so if you have any questions, just write them in the chat, and then Joelle will read them out at the end of the presentation, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. And okay, here should work. I'm gonna turn off my video. Can you see my screen? I know you just muted yourself, Joelle, but if someone can.
Yes, I can see your screen. And before you get started, I do just want to say something I forgot to mention. If you're on an iPad or on a phone mobile device, if you click the 3 buttons, that's how you get to and view the group chat. So just in case you were wondering with that. All right, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor at York University, and I've been studying native bees since the early 2000s. So I like to say before it was cool, but since then it's become kind of this really interesting topic to be working on, because so many people have really jumped on the bandwagon, I guess you could say, and pollinator conservation has become something of interest, both politically and among the public. So I'll just get started to kind of by just talking a little bit about insect declines in general. So in 2017, this study was released, and it was the most shared scientific study of the year on social media. And that was because the findings were just so striking. It was done in Germany and 63 protected areas over almost 30 years. And what they found was there was between a 76 and 82% decline in insect biomass during that time. And this is in protected areas where there wasn't a lot of land use change. So this is really striking and concerning for a lot of reasons, as you can imagine. Just gonna check here on the chat in case anyone's having issues. Oh, I can't really see it.
Nope, looks pretty good from our end. It looks like you're
Okay,
coming in clear. Yeah.
Okay, so insects are important for a variety of reasons, including they are, forage for lots of different animals. They provide natural pest control. They provide all sorts of population control. And what we're here to talk about is pollinators. So pollination is done in a whole bunch of plants. About 3/4 of our plants globally require some sort of animal pollination or benefit from animal pollination. So what that means is the plant will produce something that will attract an animal pollinator. Usually that's pollen and nectar. Sometimes it can be things like floral oils and other things, but in general, it's the nectar that pollinators are after. They go into a flower, they will drink the nectar. It's a good source of carbohydrates and other things as well. And in doing so, they'll move around pollen grains from flower to flower, and then this movement of pollen will then lead to the production of fruit and seeds in a variety of plants. And these fruits and seeds are clearly important for our wildlife, like birds and larger mammals, but also 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat is estimated to either benefit from or require some sort of animal pollination. So now I just have a few pictures from National Geographic. They did a special about pollinators quite a few years ago now. Just to show you pollination in action. And often when people talk about pollinators, they think of butterflies, but this picture shows exactly why butterflies are terrible pollinators. They are very gangly. There's only their tongue and the bottoms of their feet where pollen can really stick onto, so they don't actually move that many pollen grains around. And they're also not very constant. If you ever watch a bee, they're constantly moving from flower to flower. They're very active, and they'll do like a trap line, and they'll go to the same flowers over and over again in the same areas. Butterflies are a little bit more sporadic. So actually, they're not great pollinators. Here's a picture of a beetle moving around some pollen grains. You can see the pollen on its body. So there are some plants that do benefit from beetle pollination. In Canada, bees are the most important pollinator groups and flies are second. So here's a picture of a type of fly that you're probably all familiar with, a mosquito. So you know that female mosquitoes will feed off of your blood. That's the protein source they use to develop their larvae. But male mosquitoes do feed off of nectar from plants, including orchids. You can see this orchid here is being pollinated by a male mosquito. This is a cocoa flower, and it is pollinated by non-biting midges. So those tiny little flies that swarm and kind of get in your teeth if you walk through them, we can thank them for the pollination of our chocolate. This is a sweat bee and a tomato plant, and tomatoes, like many other of our garden plants, require something called Buzz-pollination, which means the pollen is only released if the bee grabs on tightly with its mandibles and then vibrates at a certain frequency. So that's so that the plant doesn't waste pollen on the wrong pollinators, I guess. So this is something that they've co-evolved to do. So the plant only releases pollen when it's buzz-pollinated, and only a few types of bees can do this behavior. So some sweat bees, some leafcutter bees, and bumblebees can all buzz-pollinate, but honeybees cannot buzz-pollinate. So I'm a conservation biologist. My bias, I guess, is towards conserving native biodiversity and learning more about the ecology of biodiversity. And we know from other wildlife species that in order to conserve the species, you have to know a lot about it. You have to know how it forages, where it lives, where it nests, where it migrates, where it overwinters. And these are just some examples of things where we have that information. So for caribou, we know that there are different ecotypes. So there are types that live in large groups in the forest, or small groups in more open areas. For the orca whales, we know that their migratory routes are really important. Learning how they move through really impacts whether or not they will be hit by ships, for example. Sage grouse in Alberta have caused all sorts of headaches for all sorts of developers because they're specialized to certain habitat types. And then even here we have a monarch, which everybody knows feeds off of milkweed. But for some reason, when we talk about bee conservation, this all goes out the window and everyone just kind of thinks like all bees are in decline for the same reason, or all bees are the same, or what have you. So these are just some screenshots from if you Google bee declines and the kind of thing that you get. You get a lot of sort of alarmist material. You get pictures of flies that are misidentified as bees. You hear a lot about honeybees, a lot about pesticides. And this is both in news articles, science articles, but also popular media has really picked up on this issue. And when I was a PhD student, I think it was in 2005 or 2006, I went to an international pollinator conference in Iowa, and I remember meeting two Scandinavians, and they were just completely blown away by how much people were concerned about conserving the European honeybee in North America. It was just so mind-boggling to them that this non-native species was being prioritized so much in so many presentations, and that people were worried about it. And that's something that's kind of stuck with me throughout my entire career in this field. So essentially, North America's favorite pollinator is one that's not native to North America. It's the European honeybee. It's invasive in many parts of the world. It's a very successful generalist. It's competitive. It has huge colonies, and they have a waggle dance where they can communicate where the best food sources are to each other. So far, as far as we know, our other bees do not have this ability to communicate with each other in terms of where to go get the best food. In terms of the managed honeybee hives, there are really high levels of diseases right now. Varroa mites are almost at 100%, and there are all sorts of other diseases. There are actually hundreds of diseases. So a lot of the times beekeepers are mostly managing the diseases, and very rarely would you be able to find a disease-free hive. There's high variation in beekeeper ability and capacity. So in some cases, there are these professional beekeepers who are doing this for work to bring in honeybees to agricultural areas where we need extra pollination. But then on the other hand, there are people who think they're helping our ecosystems by just having a hive on their roof in cities and kind of leaving them alone and being organic about it and not treating diseases as needed. And that actually can cause a whole bunch of problems, including for beekeepers, because then you have disease outbreaks and all the hives within a certain area need to be burned, for example. I also work with the IUCN Red List. I'm the North American coordinator for the Bumblebee Specialist Group, and we have criteria that are globally recognized. So the Red List, the global Red List is where you can find if species are at risk. And as far as the calculations show, the European honeybee is not at risk of extinction. This was kind of striking. So I mentioned before that the public support for this topic has really grown since I started working on it. And recently, just a couple of weeks ago, National Geographic had a Facebook poll. And the question was, if you could dedicate your life to saving one species, what would you choose? And the top answer was a bee, which is funny because there are 20,000 species of bees, not one. But also, apparently, I'm living this dream job that I didn't even know was a dream job when I started working on this. But it's also quite striking to see that the bee won over like a tiger, a shark, koalas. They're so cute. So it's been really striking to me to just see how much this the public interest has grown. And we see this also in the media coverage. I've talked to science reporters which have told me that when they publish about bees, they get a ton more clicks than when they publish about other animals. And I help run a citizen science project, Bumblebee Watch, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But you can really see the participation in these citizen science projects, which are really important for data collection, has increased. And there's a lot of really passionate people who are working to help us. In 2014, 2015, the Wynne government came into government and released a pollinator action plan, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And it ended up being the most commented on item in 20 years since the existence of the public registry and the Environmental Bill of Rights. It received 52,000 comments, 47,000 or so, which were form letters from NGOs and beekeeping associations. So those things where you just click on an email and then you'll send a letter automatically. But for the other letters, I had a master's student, Allison Nichols here, who went through to try to gauge why people felt so passionate about this issue in Ontario. Because the Climate Change Action Plan was also released the same week as the Pollinator Action Plan, and whereas pollinators got 52,000 comments, the Climate Change Action Plan only got about 500 comments. So we were really curious as to why this was so popular. And what she found, well, of all of the letters, including the form letters, they were by far in support of the proposal, especially the part which focused on, they said banning neonics, which didn't end up being the case. But for me as a scientist, what was interesting was her finding for the non-form letters that only about a third mentioned any sort of evidence, which includes anecdotal evidence, and some of that evidence was actually media reports, but only 8 comments of all of these 52,000 comments referred to any sort of peer-reviewed science, and those were probably myself and my colleagues that were writing in. So science really took a back seat in all of this, and it kind of shows with what was the outcome. So some other things she coded, she went through the comments and she found that what people were really interested in and found important were the actual bees themselves. They wanted to protect the bees themselves and the ecosystem services that they provided, which is pollination. We were wondering if because of the pesticide component, if maybe people were writing in because they were like anti-pesticide industry or worried about human health or what have you, but really it seemed like bees and pollination services were the main things that people were writing about. So about 3/4 of the people writing in just said bees, and I guess about just over 20% either said honeybees or implied honeybees by talking about honey or wax. So just over 5% mentioned any other type of bee when they wrote in. And since this study, we've also commissioned a poll in partnership with Friends of the Earth Canada, where we interviewed 2,000 Canadians over the telephone. And what we found was a little bit concerning again. So even though people do care a ton about bees, the public knowledge about bees is really limited. So 51% of those surveyed named the European honeybee as a native or wild bee. And 11% of the participants could not name any single wild bee type, like they couldn't even name a bumblebee or a carpenter bee or anything like that. 2/3 were unsure if wild bees could, what does it say here? If managed honeybees could replace wild bees, so they weren't sure if we could use managed honeybees to replace the pollination services that wild bees produce. 42% believed all bee species were endangered, and this is a really important finding, as I'll talk about a little bit more. In terms of threats, 89% thought the loss of pesticides, and then next with 79% was the loss of flowers, and those don't add up clearly because people were able to choose more than one option. But this is really something, the narrative of what's causing bee declines, this idea of pesticides and the loss of flowers being the main things. Is something that's been really picked up by the media and NGOs and isn't entirely accurate, as I'll go into in a bit. And we found quite striking differences across where the different provinces were. So people in BC and Quebec were more concerned than people in Alberta. And again, people really cared about the ecosystem services that bees provided. And because of all of this public interest, there's been a bunch of public policy that's come out of it. I worked with some folks on the Toronto pollinator strategy. This one here on the left is the Pollinator Partnership Action Plan that Obama put through. And it really does focus on honeybee health and monarchs. It talks a little bit about habitat, but it focuses more on habitat for beekeepers so that beekeepers can bring their honeybees into forage when they're not working in fields. And then the Ontario Health Action Plan ended up really focusing on honeybee health, reducing neonicotinoids, and then 2 years later, they added a bit about restoring pollinator habitat, but there weren't any real metrics associated with it. And in terms of the neonic reduction, while the media kind of covered it as it being banned, it ended up being something called an aspirational target with no real follow-up or enforcement. So whether or not it actually led to something, it's kind of unclear, which is kind of disappointing given how popular this plan was in terms of public support. So you know everyone cares about honeybees, but there's actually a really strong economic case for promoting native pollinators. And part of it is, like I mentioned, honeybees can't do buzz pollination, so they can't pollinate some crops very well, like tomato and cranberry and eggplant and peppers and blueberries, all these things that need buzz pollination. But additionally, they have been kind of overlooked, I guess, in terms of agricultural pollination. So there are many, many studies, and these are just some titles of some studies that show that even in areas with honeybees, wild pollinators will enhance food crop. They will provide insurance if honeybees, if the colonies have losses, and they might even be providing the majority of crop pollination. There are also, in addition to economic costs, economic reasons, there are socio-cultural reasons to conserve native bees. Beekeeping is a hobby which requires space, time, and money. So it's a privilege to be able to have your own bees and provide your own ecosystem services. Not everybody has that ability, particularly if you think about community gardens in dense urban areas. Places where people need their food to be pollinated but don't have the time or money or space to have their own beehive. We have a bunch of native plants which are culturally important to First Nations and Indigenous peoples, which have co-evolved with our native pollinators. So they have these different relationships with our we actually have over 900 native bee species now, or other pollinators. So I have a student who's working on tobacco pollination right now, which is a really important ceremonial plant. And we're finding that it is probably pollinated at night by moths. So our native pollinators cannot exactly be replaced. And then there might be some issues with the loss of important plants because of that. So I mentioned that community gardens depend on free pollination services. And it's also important to note that even if people do have honeybees, those honeybees can displace or reduce bee communities over time. And this is something that requires a bit more study, but it could impact future years of pollination services if you have a lot of honeybees in an area and then you remove them. And then when you think about climate change, study after study has shown that the more different species you have in a system, the more resilient that system is to any sort of environmental change. So if we want to be able to have our pollination services, then having as many bee species in a system is critical to be able to weather some of these issues that we're coming up to. So we have over 20,000 species of bees in the world. There's over 900 now species in Canada. In the Greater Toronto Area or Southern Ontario, we have over 350 species. So they're very, very diverse, and we're still learning about new species. This one was collected by Jason Gibbs and identified. It was found in the Annex, right downtown Toronto. So that was a new species in 2010, and there are new species being discovered all the time. And basically what we are taught about bees, or at least what most people are taught about bees, is actually quite inaccurate. Most of our bees live in the ground. So you can see this picture of this bee coming out of this sandy little hole. The vast majority of our bee species live in the ground like this. They're solitary. Most of them can't even sting you. They come in all sorts of shapes and colors: green, blue, orange, metallic-y silver, not the sort of yellow and black striped thing that we sort of get in our cartoons. And none of our bees make honey. All of our native bees are adapted to sleep over the winter, so they do not collect extra pollen and nectar for food over the winter because they don't need it. Whereas honeybee hives, which are very large, do collect extra food to stay awake over the winter. And that means that they actually remove a lot more resources in terms of pollen and nectar out of ecosystems than our native bees do. So here are some examples of groups of native bees. These are the leafcutter bees, and because they cut these little pieces of leaves to protect their eggs, they can't actually carry their pollen with their legs, so they carry their pollen on their abdomen. So if you see a bee that has a ton of pollen more on its abdomen than its legs, it's probably a leafcutter bee of some sort. And these leafcutter bees live in pithy stems, things like teasel and raspberry, sort of stronger woody stems. We have mining bees. Mining bees are among the first to emerge in the springtime. They're mostly ground nesters. They look a lot like honeybees. They're solitary. They like sandy soil. We find them a lot in playgrounds here in the city. They're especially important for early blooming trees like apples and cherries, things that need to be pollinated quite early. Sweat bees, these are the largest, this is the largest and most diverse group. They tend to be either dull gray or metallic green. They both nest in the ground, but also in stems. And there's hundreds of different species of sweat bees. Carpenter bees, a lot of people are familiar with because they have adapted to now live in pressure-treated wood more than in natural substrates. So where you have a nice deck, they will move in. They make this hole. They're quite large, and they're one of the more successful native bees. They're expanding in their range, and they're quite common. We also have the small carpenter bee, which lives in raspberry stems. You can see here. So in terms of my research, I have been working on trying to figure out if wild bees are at risk of extinction. And I mostly work on bumblebees. It's a smaller group of the 20,000 bees. They're quite large and fuzzy. We have good historic data because people have been paying attention to them for a long time. They're most diverse where it's sort of cooler weather and more in temperate areas. Their highest diversity is in Mongolia, Tibet, the Pyrenees, and the Alps. And pretty much wherever you have a temperate tundra or montane habitat, you'll have bumblebees as long as there's a predictable winter. And they like open flower-rich habitats. And unlike most of our other bees, they do live in hives. So in the wintertime, the queen overwinters in a diapause state, so she's basically sleeping. Depending on the species, she'll come out in the spring, either in April or May or June. And the queen will forage and try to build up some of the fat stores that she lost while she was hibernating. So she will drink nectar to do this. Once she has enough nectar and pollen, she'll find a nest site. She'll make a pollen ball. She'll lay some eggs. And then the workers are produced from those eggs. And the workers take over all of the nest duties while the queen just focuses on laying eggs. At some point, depending on the species, for one species, it's maybe late June, but other species, they can go all the way until September, October. She'll switch and she'll start making new queens and males. They go out and mate. The mated queens overwinter, and the entire colony dies with the frost. So this is it shows you why they don't actually need to store food over the winter time. So I used, with my collaborators, the IUCN Red List criteria, which are globally recognized metrics to determine whether species are at risk of extinction. And we assess all of the North American species, bumblebee species, which there are 46 species. So we went to insect collections, identified bees, and georeferenced them. And we were able to put together this database, which is now over 600,000 records. When we published the book, The Bumblebees of North America, we used this data set to produce a lot of our graphs and range maps, but we also use this to assess their species, their status assessments as well. So what we found was about 60% are not at risk of extinction, and then about a quarter, or 11 species, are at risk of extinction, and this varies. So there were a few species that are critically endangered, which means they've declined by probably over 70% over the past few decades. And then there are other species which are kind of slowly declining over time, but the declines have not been as drastic. The data deficient species are the ones up north where we either didn't have enough historical information to compare to, or we didn't have enough recent survey work to know how they were doing. And these are some of the maps that show you some of the differences with these species. So for the western bumblebee, this is a species at risk of extinction. It came out as vulnerable. The black dots are the historic range, and the white dots or white squares are more recent. And what we found with this species, it's at lower elevations and in the southern portions of its range, it's become a little bit more rare. But you can still find it in some spots. This is the rusty patch bumblebee, which I've focused on for a lot of my research. And this one had a huge range throughout the eastern US, southern Ontario, southern Quebec, and it completely disappeared through most of its range. And even now we only find it in some pockets in Minnesota, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The last known Canadian record was in 2009 when I found it at Pinery Provincial Park, and I was just there last weekend looking for it, and I've been going, or my lab has been going every year since then, and we have not found it since 2009. So that was the last Canadian record for the species, even though the museum data shows us that it was one of the top 5 most common species in the 70s and 80s in southern Ontario. So when you think about the main threats that people are talking about in terms of bee declines, this map doesn't exactly match up. So we can't explain this decline with pesticide use because it has declined throughout the Smoky Mountains and other protected areas where pesticides are not used. It's a habitat generalist. We have records from downtown Toronto, from all sorts of cities. It actually is still found right in downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. It's found at the zoo as well. So it's a generalist. We know it visits over hundreds of different species of plants. So it can't be flower loss or habitat loss in that sense. So what we think for this species is that a disease was introduced with managed bees that rapidly went through and knocked out most of its populations, and it's only just sticking around in a few populations on the west side of its range. So this is very similar to what we saw with the bats, with the white nose syndrome that was introduced, and how that really knocked out the populations by a lot in a short amount of time. So this is very similar. And this species is listed as endangered in both Canada and the US, and it's the only species that's listed in both countries. This is another species at risk that occurs in southern Ontario. It's called the American bumblebee, and CASARO is actually meeting to assess this species in November, I believe. So it has declined by about 90% in terms of relative abundance, but we can still find it. So it's a species that my lab can still work on because we can still find it and learn more about it and try to conserve the populations before they disappear. This is one of the species that is not in any sort of risk of extinction as far as we know. This is the common Eastern bumblebee. It has one yellow stripe on the abdomen. It's very easy to identify. It's used in greenhouses and for field pollination. It's managed by and produced by a few egg companies. And it has slowly been increasing its native range. So it's now found in the Maritimes and in Algonquin Park, where historically it was not in those areas. So it seems to be quite common. So this goes against kind of the public idea of all bees being extinct. Some of them are actually doing okay. Or all bees being endangered. So what I'm interested in is trying to figure out why some are in decline and what we can do for those that are at risk of extinction, because the goal for me, as I said, is to conserve as much native biodiversity as possible. So these are the main threats for bumblebees in kind of order of importance. Pathogen spillover, so introduced diseases from managed bees, both managed bumblebees, but also a growing concern around diseases brought in by honeybees as well. Climate change, because they're cold weather adapted animals that are very tightly linked to different plants, especially when they first emerge. And then they are generalists because they fly for a long time. They have a long season. But there are a lot of things about climate change that might be impacting them. They don't store food, for example, like honeybees do. They maybe only have 1 or 2 days of food. So if there's a drought or a storm that kills off the flowers, they could be particularly vulnerable. Invasive species, both invasive plants and invasive insects. And in some cases, even invasive predators could be a problem. Pesticide use, including neonics. So neonics neonics don't describe the declines that we've seen, but they are developed specifically to kill insects. So where they are used, they are harmful, but other pesticides that are used on things like cornfields and things are also harmful to insects. So neonics aren't particularly harmful in that sense. And then habitat loss. Bumblebees need forage, overwintering, and nesting sites, and all 3 of those are completely different. So having those in close proximity together might be something that's a bit challenging, especially when so many people focus on creating pollinator habitat by just planting flowers and not thinking about the other components. So I have a PhD student, Amanda, who focused on 2 species at risk in Southern Ontario, the American bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee. And she tried to figure out what it was about their habitats that, what their habitats looked like in places where they had recently occurred. And even though they both occur in Southern Ontario, they need completely different habitats. So the yellow-banded bumblebee is more associated with spring and early summer flowers, with woodlands, with marshes. The American bumblebee is more associated with late flowers like thistles and goldenrods and open and agricultural landscapes. And so this kind of goes back to one of my first slides that showed how we need to understand more about bumblebee ecology or species ecology and habitat needs to properly conserve them. Because this shows you that even 2 that look similar and occur in the same region can have completely different habitat requirements. So this means that we can't just have one size plan to fit all conserving of all the bees. We can choose our restoration and reintroduction sites, thinking about the broader landscape and making sure that we can support the species that are most at risk of extinction. We can look at range edges and support species there so we can help them with climate change. And we have found that species that come out later in the summer might be more vulnerable, maybe because they kind of run out of time to collect enough food and nectar to produce a lot of new individuals for the next year. So things like goldenrod and late summer plants are particularly important as well. I have a postdoctoral fellow who's working on a framework for a national pollinator strategy A lot of countries in Europe, in the UK have pollinator strategies, but in Canada, all we have is a honeybee roundtable that meets every so often, but we haven't really figured out a way to sort of integrate a lot of these things across the country, despite, again, the public interest in the topic. So she's putting together a framework to describe what a national pollinator strategy might look like. And we're going to take an interdisciplinary approach, so using science, natural science, but also social science, talking to and interviewing diverse stakeholders and knowledge holders, including farmers. One of the things out of the Ontario Pollinator Action Plan was that because it focused so heavily on pesticides as the main threat to bees, it kind of pitted farmers against beekeepers and farmers against urban dwellers, and it really just caused a lot of animosity because it only focused on that one narrow issue. So we're taking sort of a broader approach and thinking about different ways that people can work together. And now that there are a lot of other policies from other jurisdictions, we can pull from that and see what's worked and what hasn't. And we're going to think about how we can support pollinators, not just in agricultural lands, but also in cities, in protected areas, and forests, that kind of thing. And again, not just focusing on pesticides, but also climate change and disease introduction, which is one of the main threats to our native bees. We've had so much success with Bumblebee Watch. It really seems like including citizen science for long-term monitoring can really help direct us and inform our management of species at risk. But also, like that study in Germany, it would be good for us to have regular surveys in protected areas to give us sort of a baseline long-term data set to work with, so we know what's going on with our species. And we're focusing on native biodiversity, conservation, at-risk species, and the climate crisis. So I mentioned that I was involved with the Toronto Pollinator Strategy, and this one is one of the few in North America that actually focuses on native bees and not honeybee conservation. So it's free if you want to just Google it. You can download the PDF. And essentially there was a city councilor who was approached by one of their constituents who just wanted to save the bees. They didn't know what that meant, but they just wanted to do it. And they, but the city staff were a lot more educated on the topic. And they put together an advisory group that had some academics, some NGOs, people who were experts in plants and bees, a couple of beekeepers. And this strategy went through unanimously in City Hall and received thousands of comments that were in support of it as well. And like what we're focusing on for our national pollinator strategy, it does focus on resilient and native pollinators, including at-risk species. So those that we know that might go extinct if we don't take some sort of action. When we talk about habitat, we're not just talking about plants for nectar and pollen, but we're also talking about nesting and overwintering and creating corridors so that there's gene flow across different areas. We talk about all sorts of different threats, but also that it's really complex and that we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of species. So we can't just blame a single threat or do a single thing that will support all of our pollinators. And right at the beginning, you'll see that we talk about that there are some impacts of honeybees on native bees, and the literature on this is growing. And we talk about the importance of citizen science and collaborations with university-led research as well. So I'll switch now to talk about how you can help, because that is frequently what I get asked, like what can people do? And the answer is not buying a bee condo or having your own honeybee hive. If you haven't gathered that quite yet. The number one thing that you can do is submit sightings to Bumblebee Watch and help us collect data. In fact, most of our sightings for the rescue patch bumblebee in the USA have been submitted by people who have taken pictures and submitted them to us. We have a free phone app for both Android and Apple products. And we have a website, which I prefer to use. I find the website a little bit easier. And this will help us not only locate rare species, but also keep track of common ones, so that if a common one starts declining, we will have some sort of information about that. So don't just think you need to take pictures of rare species. We're also collecting all different bumblebee species on this one. And it'll help us figure out where the bees are, if they're expanding their ranges, what food plants they like, where they're nesting. All sorts of important information is coming out of this. This slide's kind of weird, but so the other thing you can do is, if you do have space to plant pollinator habitat and you're interested in native plants, be sure to include plants that go all the way from the spring into the fall. Often when I see people talking about pollinator plants, they talk about bee balm and echinacea and sort of these things that grow kind of June, July, August, but not too many people throw in some goldenrod or, you know, some pussy willow in the springtime, or Virginia bluebells or early blooming plants. So really think about having food for them as soon as they emerge, and all the way into the fall. Make sure you tell your friends about all the different types of bees there are, and when people are swatting away those annoying invasive German yellow jackets, you can, and calling them bees, you can correct them and let them know that those are invasive wasps. But really, when I talk to people about how diverse our native bees are, even people who are avid bird watchers are surprised. They didn't know that there were that many species of bees. So just spreading the word is a really important way to kind of go against this narrative that's really dominated the media in terms of like the honeybee being an important native bee and being the only thing that we need to protect. You can encourage land managers to protect and restore high quality habitat. I really like the idea of community gardens as pollinator gardens as well, because when people are out there gardening, they're talking to each other, they're observing pollinators on their plants. There's this active like connection being made to people with the plants and the insects. And I think that goes a long way with convincing people that we need to conserve pollinators, especially wild pollinators. And then again, going back to that example with the Ontario Pollinator Action Plan getting 52,000 comments, but the Climate Change Action Plan only getting 500 comments in the same week, it really goes to show you that people think that pollinator decline is somehow disconnected from bigger environmental issues like climate change or urbanization or what have you. But they are quite linked. So if you're thinking about the climate crisis, then maybe, and you're trying to people who are maybe a little bit less, willing to deal with the climate crisis, maybe getting them to conserve pollinators is the way to get them to do that. So creating native tall grass prairie is important for pollinators, but it also is really important for carbon capture as well. See what's going on here. Can't change my slides. So along with the conversations, also be aware of BeeWashing, which is a term I believe Scott MacGyver coined. And it's all over. Once you start noticing it, you'll see it. And it's also the environmental NGOs doing this. It's not just companies doing this. So here we have a picture of the Sierra Club saying that honeybees are endangered, which they are not, and celebrating them for Endangered Species Day, which is so odd when you think about something that's been introduced to North America and it's not native. All sorts of different things. So the beehives on roofs, this company Alveole has really spent a lot of time and energy trying to convince people that having beehives on your roof is a way to fight bee declines, which actually it probably is not. It's probably adding more competition to our native bees and diseases to our native bees. In the city of Toronto, we've gone from just a couple hundred honeybee hives to over 800 registered hives in just a few years. So That's millions and millions of new honeybees and not a lot of new habitat in this area. So do keep an eye out for this kind of bee washing now that you know a little bit more about native bees. So just to wrap up, from my time working on pollinator conservation, even though I'm a conservation scientist with a biology training, I've come to understand that actually this is more of a social problem, socio-ecological issue. So there's intense public interest, a lot of industry and NGOs are involved, government wants to be involved, but they take their cues from NGOs and the public. There's not a lot of space for scientists to help inform the management issues, even though there is a huge body of scientific knowledge and we have a lot that we can work with in terms of designing policy around that. Bees are not a monolith, so some are in decline, some are actually increasing, some are more threatened by things like pesticides or climate change or diseases. And in the same species could be threatened by two different threats depending on where it is, because a lot of them have these massive ranges across North America as well. So conservation management plans need to involve scientists and other knowledge holders. And while we do have a lot more work to do in terms of our native bees, I only mentioned our species assessments for bumblebees because those are the ones that we know the best, but that's really only about 50 of our 900 species of wild bees. So we have hundreds and hundreds of species. We still don't know how they're doing in the wild and what their ecology is and how they use habitats. So even though we have these knowledge gaps, we can still do better than we are doing right now. So with that, I will thank you all for being here, and I can take some questions.
Great. There are some really, really great questions coming in the chat. Thank you so much for that. There was so much really incredible information that you gave us. Okay, so here is a good question. Have there been any studies that have determined whether native bees are more sensitive to pesticides compared to European honeybees?
It's a good question. I'm sure there have been. There have been more and more studies that also look at bumblebees and squash bees more recently. One of the reasons why honeybees are more susceptible is because they're actually like taken to agricultural lands to pollinate in these degraded habitats. So a cornfield is a terrible place for a native bee, but honeybees are brought into a field next to a cornfield and get exposed to pesticides in that way. So that's part of why they're a little bit more, the beekeepers really fought against neonics because they're more exposed to it just because of how the bees are moved. But I'm sure there are ways that native bees are also more susceptible to pesticides. So if something is sprayed early in the spring, then you might hit some species that are early on. They emerge early on, and then there are like ground nesting bees. A lot of our native bees are ground nesters. So if there are any kind of pesticides that specifically go into the ground, like the squash bee, for example, might be very susceptible to something like that. So there are a lot, like I said, it's very, very complicated and there are no real easy answers. I wish there was. I wish I could just say, if we could ban this one type of pesticides, we would solve all of our problems, but unfortunately that is not the case.
Okay, that makes sense. So here is another question for you. Do any native bees produce honey, or could we use them for honey collection?
No. The native sweetener to North America is maple syrup. There are some native honeybees in Mexico and in South America, but in Canada and the US, we don't have any bees that make
honey. And I know you kind of talked about this a little bit. Do you have any favorite, a lot of people are asking what they can do as backyard gardeners. I know you already talked about planting plants throughout the season. Do you have any kind of favorites that you might recommend to anybody?
For the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, the best flower, the one that we found it most often on historically, was American, was it Columbine? Is that the common name for it? That red flower. Bee balm is great, any of the mints and roses. Really, it's just important to have a variety of different plants, but also quite a few of them. So if you just have one type, like one plant of milkweed, that maybe it'll be okay if you have a lot of neighbors that also have milkweed, but bees are quite constant, which makes them good pollinators. So they'll only learn one or two flowers, and then they'll only go to those flowers, which is why the pollen gets deposited into the right flowers. But if you just have one or two of a native plant, then they won't learn that flower, and they won't then. So that's why sometimes you'll go to a protected area and there's like beautiful native, prairie plants, but all of the bees are on like the spotted knapweed or whatever, because there's just so much more of it. So they'll learn the more common flower. So it's balancing the number of flowers, but also the diversity of native flowers. It's kind of challenging, but if you work with your neighbors or work together to do kind of a larger like community garden, that might be a way to get around that.
Great tip there. Another question, all about kind of community science, citizen science. Do you recommend a particular methodology to study these bees for citizen scientists? How do you best suggest they go and help to collect this data for Bumblebee Watch?
Yeah, so we use Bumblebee Watch in a few ways. It's integrated with some of the atlases, so there are like some more systematic places where we collect data. With Wildlife Preservation Canada, I believe they have programs running at the Pinery and Owenda Provincial Parks. So those parks are kind of more regularly, people go and take pictures and submit them to the app. But in general, just going out there and taking pictures, especially if you leave cities, because a lot of our photos are from like places where there's a lot of human density as well. So if you're ever out in a protected area or just in rural areas, that's really helpful as well. So we'll take anything really. Okay.
Similarly with Bumblebee Watch, does it talk to iNaturalist at all in any way? Can the data be synced between?
We haven't integrated the two yet, mostly because iNaturalist is identified by community members, and we're trying to keep the identification accuracy really high. Bumblebees are a lot harder to identify to species than people think they are. And that includes me. Like, I've written a book about it now, and I feel the least confident identifying bumblebees that I have in my entire career. Like, my first year of my PhD was when I was the most confident in my identification skills. So that is the reason why we haven't integrated it. We have experts doing the identifications, because then we use these data for expert testimony to governments and things like that. So we don't have plans just yet, but that's the reason why. And it is a bit challenging to have all these different citizen science programs, but we haven't really found a solution to that problem just yet.
Makes sense. Just a couple more questions here. Someone wants to know, are wasps bad?
We have many native wasps that are really important, and a lot of them are specialized. So you'll know of the cicada killer wasp, for example, which specializes on cicadas, and we have a lot of specialist wasps that will keep down caterpillar populations and that kind of thing. The ones that are in cities that are super annoying, the yellow jackets and paper wasps, are non-native species, so they kind of give all of our native wasp species a bad rap. And many, just like bees, many of our wasp species are actually solitary and won't bother you. So it's like the more aggressive ones tend to be the ones that are the ones that live in the hives as well. So it's just that I wouldn't say at all that wasps are bad, but there are some invasive species that have given all wasps and bees a bad rap, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Yeah.
I could even talk a little bit about the murder hornet situation, which is also a giant
Sure.
head.
Yeah, you can mention that. Yeah, definitely.
So people are really concerned about this species, and to me, it kind of highlights the broader problem, which is that we have this really common non-native species, the honeybee. So the giant Asian hornet has co-evolved with honeybees to eat honeybee hives, I guess. And they have sort of defense mechanisms. The honeybees that have evolved with it have defense mechanisms where they go around it and heat it up, and that's how they kill it. Like they'll have thousands of bees kill the hornets that way. But by having these non-native honeybees in North America, it also means that their predators might be able to, might be facilitated in North America too. So to me, when people talk about the presence of this new predator, which has only been found in BC and Canada as far as I know, it points to the fact that we need to keep as many native species and support our biodiversity and not try to augment our invasive species even more, because there's the problems of the diseases they bring in, but also the predators that they can bring in as well.
That makes a lot of sense. More questions about iNaturalist. Do you go through some of the iNaturalist submissions and data to kind of cross-check and see if there are decent enough pictures that they can be ID'd at all, or do you get enough?
Yeah, we do, especially for if there are sightings of rare species, we'll definitely keep track of those.
Okay, great. And then the last question is, and I'm sure it's not going to be an easy one to answer, but a lot of what you've talked about tonight is the misinformation, especially with European honeybees and saving the bees. Where do you think the root of that is? Was there a root kind of cause of that? Where do you think, how do you think this all became so common?
Yeah, so I guess there's probably a variety of ways. The more obvious one is probably just following the money. So the people who are impacted the most financially by issues like pesticide issues are the ones that financially benefit from saving the honeybees, I guess. So they have all sorts of PR options that individual scientists like myself don't have. In terms of the NGOs that I've spoken to, when they are such good advocates for native habitats and native spaces, and so I've asked them why they've teamed up with the honeybee situation, because they would never promote the Asian carp or pigeons or any other non-native species, or chickens. Chickens would be a really good analogy. Are you trying to save the birds by promoting people to have backyard chickens? It doesn't make any sense. And what I've heard is people believe that if people fall in love with honeybees, then they might protect other pollinators, or it's kind of like a gateway, or it's just a more simple story, because there's so much complexity when you talk about all the hundreds of different types of species that we have. So, and then of course honey can't be beat, so that also is quite popular, to be able to have a honey tasting party and all this stuff. So they're just a little bit more of an easier sell, and people who don't want to do the hard work of the challenging science communication jump on to honeybees as a way to engage people about pollinators, which puts me in a tough position in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely get that. All right. Well, I just wanted, I think that's it for tonight. I just wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Colla, for coming and giving us all of this incredible information. It was really, really knowledgeable. You did a really fantastic job. For people who joined in a little bit later, a reminder that we will be posting this on our YouTube channel, and anybody who registered on Eventbrite, you'll get a link to that. And we, again, wanted to thank our funders, because without them and without funders and donators like you, supporters, this wouldn't have been possible. So thank you again to Dr. Colla. Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight and to our funders as well. And I hope you have a really lovely evening.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Thanks. Have a great night, everyone.